My name is Louise, and I'm turning 34 this year. After finishing college, I landed a job at a big company that most people would recognize. The pay was good, even for someone just starting out, but it came with a catch. I had to travel for work about half the month and often worked late nights and holidays. It was a tough job, but I felt accomplished. When I turned 28, I got promoted to head of my department, which was a fast climb, especially for a woman. 4 years ago, I married my boyfriend Brian, who I'd been dating for 2 years. We met through a mutual friend. I wasn't really interested in dating, but my friend was worried about me and introduced us. I never felt the need to get married and was content with staying single, but Brian made it clear from the start that he wanted to get married soon and have kids, believing it would be easier to raise them while we were younger. I didn't want kids, and the idea of marriage seemed strange since we hadn't known each other long. Plus, I had just been promoted and couldn't imagine dealing with marriage and pregnancy at that time. Whenever Brian mentioned marriage, I would gently push back, saying, "You're rushing things. We need to get to know each other better. Marriage isn't just about us." Brian then suggested, "Okay, let's get married after 2 years of dating. By then, we'll know each other well, right?" I thought we wouldn't make it 2 years, but we did, and we eventually got married. During our relationship, Brian was loyal, didn't gamble, and treated me kindly. He was hardworking and dedicated to his job, but his strong ego was something that always bothered me a little. When a senior at work would point out something to Brian, he would come home and rant, saying, "I did it because I thought it was best, but they act so bossy. I don't need to be told what to do." When I listened to him closely, it was clear he was being called out for mistakes, but he just couldn't handle being criticized, whether by a superior or not. When we decided to have a dinner with both of our families to introduce them, Brian picked a restaurant that charged over $200 per person and asked me to pay half. Since it was so expensive, I suggested a more affordable place, but Brian insisted, "This is important. If I choose a cheap restaurant, they'll think I'm stingy." He wouldn't listen to my suggestion. If it was that important to him, I thought he should cover the cost himself. But he said, "I can't afford to pay for 8 people with my salary, maybe 3 at most. So please cover the remaining 5. In the end, he asked me to pay more than half. We had 4 people from each family, making a total of 8. Ryan was insisting on a pricey restaurant even though he couldn't even cover the cost for his own family. I wasn't happy with this plan, and I was even more puzzled when he told everyone at the dinner, "Don't worry about the bill today. I'll take care of it." Everyone seemed pleased, so I decided to let him take the lead in this situation, even though I bit my tongue. Looking back, I think I made a mistake. I regret not calling off my marriage to Brian, a man so full of himself. After Brian and I got married, his attitude towards me changed completely. He started talking to me in a condescending way all the time. Before we got married, he knew I was busy with work and promised to help with household chores. But once we were married, he began saying things like, "What will the neighbors think if they see a man hanging out laundry? Besides, household chores are a woman's job, right? I'm out working hard, so let me relax at home." He never lifted a finger to help, no matter how busy I was. It was frustrating because I couldn't believe he thought people would care if they saw a man doing laundry. I was fed up with his domineering attitude, but I didn't mind doing the housework, so I tolerated it. What really upset me was the fact that Brian was giving money to his parents. Although they were farmers, they seemed to be struggling financially. It seemed like they had never made much money in the past, and now, nearing their 70s, farming was becoming even more difficult. Because of this, they would often call Brian, asking him to send them money. At first, I thought it couldn't be helped since they were struggling. But within 6 months of getting married, Brian started giving all his salary to his parents. He wouldn't contribute any money towards our living expenses. I once told him, "This is too much. It's ridiculous for me to cover all the living expenses with my salary alone." But Brian replied, "How can you say such a thing when my family is in trouble? They're your family too. Besides, you make more money than I do, so you should be able to manage just fine." He wouldn't listen to me. When he talked to his parents on the phone, Brian always said, "It's fine, I'm taking care of it with my salary. I won't let her say anything about it." It sounded like he was only sending part of his salary, but in reality, he was giving all of it to his parents. He had no money left for himself and even started asking me for pocket money, saying, "Can you give me about $200? I realized things couldn't go on like this, so I suggested to Brian, "Let's set a monthly limit on how much we send to your parents, and you need to figure out how to cover your own lunch expenses." Brian always agreed, saying, "Got it, we'll do that," but he continued sending his entire salary to his parents. This was something I just couldn't stand. One day, I had to go away for a 2-week business trip. When I told Brian, he responded, "What? 2 weeks? What am I supposed to eat? And what about my laundry?" Even though he knew my job required frequent travel, he acted helpless. Annoyed by his childishness, I said, "Figure it out yourself. You are a grown man. If you can't, why don't you go stay with your parents while I'm away? You'll be fine there." Brian reluctantly agreed. When I returned home 2 weeks later, I was surprised to find Brian's sister, Elizabeth, at our house. She lived a bit away, and we hadn't seen each other since the wedding. I wondered if something had happened. Elizabeth greeted me with a big smile, saying, "Hi, Louise, it's been a while. Oh, by the way, thank you so much for the money. It was a lifesaver." I was confused and asked, "What money are you talking about?" Elizabeth replied without hesitation, "Brian said that since you have some savings, he'd provide me with startup capital for my business. He told me not to worry because you have at least $1 million saved up." I was completely baffled. Just then, Brian walked in, holding my passbook and seal. He smiled and said, "Oh, welcome back. Perfect timing. I'm giving your savings to Elizabeth. You know, she's a nail artist and has always wanted her own shop. She's been saving, but she's about $1 million short. I remembered that you had exactly $1 million saved up from before we got married, so I told her to come and get it." He then handed the passbook and seal to Elizabeth, saying with a grin, "You're lucky. This will make your dream come true. Be grateful, okay?" I couldn't hold back any longer and snapped, "What are you talking about? That's my money. Why are you deciding this on your own? I could understand if you said you wanted to lend it, but we'd need a promissory note and a clear plan to pay it back, right? What do you mean you're just going to give away someone else's savings?" I grabbed the passbook and seal back from Elizabeth. Brian looked at me and said, "What? We're family, aren't we? It's ridiculous to write a promissory note for family members. Besides, we're not lending it, we're giving it. You don't even have a hobby because you're always working, so it's a waste to just hold on to money. Elizabeth has a dream. Don't you think it's more meaningful to use the money to help her achieve it?" He glared at me, but at that moment, I realized that I couldn't communicate with him. Brian then said, "This money is too good for you, so I'm giving it to Elizabeth. You just waste it. You can work and save up again, right? If you still want to argue, we'll get divorced." Hearing this, an idea sparked in my mind. I quickly responded, "All right, let's get a divorce. I'll write up the divorce papers and send them to you. I'll come to pick up my things soon. Until the divorce is finalized, I'll stay at a hotel. Bye for now." With that, I grabbed my luggage from the business trip and left the house quickly. Brian was shocked by my sudden decision, but after a while, he sent multiple texts saying things like, "You can still come back if you apologize now. And Elizabeth says she'll forgive you for what happened today as long as you give her the money, so stop being stubborn and come back." I ignored all his texts. Who does he think he is? The next day, I went to the city hall and mailed the signed divorce papers back home. Even then, he kept texting me, saying things like, "Are you really sure about this? I'm going to submit the divorce papers, okay?" I only responded with, "Please submit them as soon as possible," and ignored all the other texts. The divorce with Brian was finalized sooner than I expected. A week after the divorce was finalized, I timed it so that I could move my things to my new house while Brian was at work. When Brian texted me about submitting the divorce papers, he said, "I feel great being able to divorce an ugly woman like you. We are strangers now. Make sure you divide our property properly since we're divorced." So I didn't take most of the furniture and appliances. At the same time, I deposited half of the small savings I had accumulated during our marriage into his bank account and left it there. That night, I got multiple calls from Brian. At first, I ignored them, thinking, "Here we go again," but after a while, Elizabeth started calling too. Finally, I picked up the phone and Brian immediately yelled, "Hey, what happened to the property division? This is ridiculous. There's only $800 in this account." I thought to myself, exactly as I expected. I told Brian, "See, I did split the property. We originally had $1,600 in our joint account. Right, I left you with half of it, $800, and all the furniture and appliances were bought after we got married, so I left them all behind. That's a fair division of property, isn't it? Just to be clear, I got less than you." But Brian wasn't convinced. He said, "What are you talking about? You're supposed to have $1 million in your savings, right? So half of that, $500,000, should be mine too. Plus, you inherited money when your grandpa died, right? Half of that should be mine too." I was shocked and couldn't help but laugh. I saw this coming, otherwise I don't think Brian would have agreed to divorce so easily. I held back my laughter and explained, "Listen, Brian, property division only applies to assets we gained during the marriage. My savings from before we got married and the inheritance I received aren't considered marital assets. I don't know who told you otherwise, but I consulted a lawyer and split everything fairly. The money we saved after getting married was all earned by me since you never contributed to our household expenses. You should be grateful I even divided that." Brian shouted, "You're lying. There's no way that's true. You can't fool me. Hand over the money or I'll sue you." He sounded desperate, but I calmly told him, "Go ahead, sue me if you want. I haven't done anything wrong and I divided everything fairly. I'm not afraid of being sued." Hearing this, Brian panicked and said, "Wait, let's forget about the divorce. I was wrong, please come back." He completely changed his tune and begged for reconciliation. I replied, "What are you talking about? The divorce is already finalized and I have absolutely no intention of coming back. This isn't a joke." Then I added, "Since this is the end, let me tell you something. If you plan on continuing to live there, you have to pay the rent yourself. The rent is about $1,800 a month. You probably didn't know that because you never pay for it." Brian weakly replied, "There's no way I can afford that." I simply said, "If you can't pay, then you'll have to leave. That's none of my business anymore." After that, it seems Brian moved back to his parents' house because he couldn't afford the rent. He didn't have enough money to cover moving expenses, so he sold the furniture and appliances I left behind to pay for it. His parents thought Brian was making a decent income and happily welcomed him, thinking he would help them financially. But in reality, Brian wasn't able to give them as much money as he did when we were together, and it seems he's now quite uncomfortable living there. Elizabeth, who had been told by Brian not to worry about money, had already started preparing to open her own business. But since she couldn't get a penny from my savings, her startup plans came to a halt. It sounds like she suffered a lot from having to cancel all the preparations she had started. Brian, in turn, seems to have been given a hard time by Elizabeth, but that's not my problem. As for me, I'm focusing on my work and enjoying living alone. I've had enough of marriage. Brian still sends me messages saying he wants to get back together, but I completely ignore them. It's kind of amusing to hear about his situation from time to time, so I've let him keep messaging me, but I'm planning to block him soon.